Hi, my name is Dan, and this is a video about the lost buildings of Hartford Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. Today it is an 867-bed hospital that occupies a 65-acre campus. The hospital was established in 1854, and its first building opened in 1860. From that time until the 1930s, the hospital built up a rambling complex of interconnected buildings, most of them 2 to 3 stories in height and constructed of brownstone. They arose over many decades in response to the hospital's continuing need for more space, and they reflect how the institution steadily adapted to changes in medical practices and incorporated new technologies. During this period, the hospital also erected an adjacent residential facility for the elderly and an additional group of structures for its nurses' training school. In the late 1930s, the hospital began to prepare for a substantial new building program that would replace the earlier complex with a better integrated and more up-to-date facility. First to be completed was the South Building in 1942, followed by the High Building in 1948. This postcard from that year captures a moment when those two modern structures had been built, but the old brownstone buildings just to the east were still standing. The following year, however, much of the old campus was taken down. A few of its buildings, dating to the 1920s and 30s, still survive today, but its oldest structures, dating to the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, were demolished. Some years later, the facility for the elderly, which was later called Jefferson House, and the old nurses' campus were also demolished. Since the 1940s, the hospital has continued to expand. Today, its facilities and those of the adjacent Connecticut Children's Medical Center are spread over a large triangular area bounded by Jefferson Street on the north, with additional property on the north side of Jefferson, Retreat Avenue on the south, and Washington Street on the west. In this video, I'm going to talk about the hospital's original campus, which was located in the eastern portion of this triangle and was bounded on the west by a south extension of Hudson Street that no longer exists. Just to the north was the site of the original Jefferson House. After describing the growth of this earlier campus, I'll continue by talking about the big construction projects the hospital undertook in the 1940s and then in the 1960s. It was during this period of expansion that much of the old campus was demolished. Before we begin, I just want to mention that if you enjoy this video and want more content like this, please hit the like button. And also hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. Now let's get started. This photograph is a view from 1917 south down Maple Avenue, with Retreat Avenue branching off on the right. At the point of the triangle formed by this intersection was a building, now lost, that was the first home of Hartford Hospital. This is a photograph of that same building circa 1880. By that time it was being used as a grocery store, but over 30 years earlier, the house had been rented by the Society for Providing a Home for the Sick. This was an organization started in 1852 through the Church Missionary Society by Christ Church, which is now the Episcopal Cathedral of Connecticut. The couple hired to look after the patients in this house could only handle a limited number of residents, so there was very soon a need to expand. On March 2, 1854, there was a devastating steam boiler explosion at the Fales and Gray Railroad Car Factory near Hartford's Dutch Point. 9 men died at the scene, 10 would later die of their injuries, and 23 others were seriously injured. The disaster highlighted the city's need for a general hospital, and so its civic leaders chartered Hartford Hospital later that year. It would take several years more for this new institution to raise the necessary funds to construct its first building. In the meantime, in 1855, the new hospital took over the Society for Providing a Home for the Sick, continuing to utilize the rented house until it could move into its own larger quarters. This is a section from Smith's 1855 map of Hartford County. It shows the house at the intersection of what's now Maple Avenue, called Haven Turnpike on this map, and Retreat Avenue. The latter took its name from the Retreat for the Insane, now called the Institute of Living. As I mentioned, the future location of Hartford Hospital would be the 9-acre triangle previously owned by the Cogswell family, formed by Retreat Avenue on the south, Jefferson Street on the north, and South Hudson Street on the west. The hospital also acquired an additional property north of Jefferson Street that would eventually become the site of what was called the Old People's Home. The plan for the future hospital, devised by architect William Russell West of Philadelphia, reflected the most modern thinking in contemporary hospital design, and would feature technology such as speaking tubes. It was a pavilion plan with an H-shaped layout of 4 two-story wings for a total of 8 wards that were kept separate to prevent the spread of disease. In its early years, the hospital primarily served the working poor because people with financial resources would be visited by doctors at home. For this reason, there were only a very few private patient rooms, which would be located in the 2 shorter cross wings. There would also be a 3-story central building containing the operating room, offices, library, and reception area. It was not planned to erect this entire structure right away. Instead, it could be built in stages as the hospital's needs grew and funds were raised. The first section of this plan to be built would be the central building and 1 ward extending from it. Let's jump ahead to our next available map, which is a section from the Baker and Tilden Hartford Atlas of 1869. In the intervening years since 1855, the neighborhood had certainly developed, with many houses having been built and new streets laid out. To the east, Samuel Colt had developed his extensive estate called Armsmere. Turning to Hartford Hospital's triangle, the map shows the completed central section and north wing. The cornerstone was laid on May 28, 1857. Construction was later paused because of the need to acquire additional funding. When the hospital first opened its doors on August 1, 1860, the building was still not completely finished, but needed to be put in use right away because of overcrowding in the rented house. During the difficult days of the Civil War, the 2 wards in the north wing were soon overcrowded. So in 1866, work had begun on the building's planned south wing. It is not represented on this map, however, because yet again funds had run out. So in 1869, there was only the incomplete shell of the addition that at that point had been standing empty for 2 years. Moving ahead 16 years, this is the hospital as depicted in the Sanborn Atlas of 1885. It shows the central building and north wing, opened in 1860, as well as the south wing and the 2 shorter connecting wings on the east side, which were all completed in 1871. The hospital could now accommodate 100 patients, and the number of private rooms had grown to 16. This is an image of the front facade along Hudson Street, showing the central building and the north and south wings extending to the right and left. The buildings were constructed of Portland brownstone. The hospital's main entrance had an elaborately decorative porte cochere, as shown in this later postcard. In the gables of the porte cochere's roof was displayed the year 1857, which was when construction of the hospital first commenced. The hospital's grounds were also landscaped, with the original plans being drawn up by landscape architect Jacob Weidenman, who donated his time. Returning to the 1885 atlas, its diagram of the hospital shows the next section of the original H-plan to be completed. This was another major wing that was finished in 1876. Situated east of the first north wing, it extended towards Jefferson Street from the north connector wing. This is an image of the hospital that appeared in the Memorial History of Hartford County, published in 1886. It is a view to the southeast with Hudson Street on the right and Jefferson Street on the left. It shows the original sections along Hudson Street built between 1857 and 1871, as well as the 1876 addition to the rear that I just mentioned. The rear section also appears on the 1877 Bird's Eye View of Hartford, which was published a year later. East of the hospital's main building were a separate series of connected outbuildings, one having a large smokestack. These structures were also depicted in the 1885 atlas. The smokestack was part of the laundry building. Its washing machines were powered by a steam engine. Attached to the laundry were several sheds and an ice house. Just north of these outbuildings, a small one-story cottage was built to isolate patients with infectious diseases. Another recent addition was attached to the rear of the south connecting wing. I believe this was the new maternity or lying-in ward built in 1883 and designed to separate expectant mothers from sick patients. As I mentioned, the hospital had acquired land on the north side of Jefferson Street for the building of a long-term care facility for elderly patients that would be operated by the hospital as a separate independent unit. Plans had been started in the 1870s, but it would take many years to complete the project. The building known as the Old People's Home was finally dedicated in 1884. Designed by architect John C. Mead, the building could house about 90 people. It contained 2 wards for men and 1 for women, and had 50 single rooms. The Old People's Home is shown here in a section from the 1896 Atlas of the City of Hartford. This map also shows further additions to the hospital complex. In 1887, a children's ward had been created on the 3rd floor of the central building. This was quickly outgrown, so a new children's ward, designed by the architectural firm of Cook, Hapgood and Company, was erected in 1891. Extending south from the lying-in ward towards Retreat Avenue, this new wing was yet another section of the original H-plan model conceived over 30 years earlier. Connected at the south end of the 70 by 20-foot ward was a 14 by 10-foot playroom that opened onto a balcony. At the same time, the outbuildings were further expanded. All the boilers and heating apparatus were moved from the hospital proper to the enlarged laundry. A morgue would also be set up, and at the east end of the row of outbuildings was a new ice house. I mentioned before the small infectious diseases cottage erected in 1884. The need for a much larger building was finally satisfied when the new Contagious Diseases Pavilion was completed in 1893. Designed by Cook, Hapgood and Company, the unadorned brick building could accommodate 19 patients in 7 different rooms. It had all the latest technology for ventilating the rooms and removing potentially germ-filled air. As written in the Hartford Courant newspaper on November 28, 1893, quote, "A shaft passes from the floor on which the wards are into the basement, and in cases where it is necessary to disinfect a patient's clothing, it is dropped into this shaft and falls into a large galvanized sheet iron box, which is encased in an oven-like contrivance with a heavy iron door. The disinfectant boiler is close by, and the clothes can be put in with but little labor, and it is unnecessary for the attendant to handle them at all. Clothes can also be put into the room from the outside through a chute arranged for the purpose." Unquote. Our next map of the hospital buildings is from the Sanborn Atlas of 1900. It shows the contagious ward I just described. The older cottage for contagious diseases had been demolished by this time. The major new structure that appears here is the U-shaped nurses' home. The hospital had started its nurses' training program back in 1877. For years, nurses lived in close proximity to the hospital's patients, and classes had been taught in whatever space was available at a given time. The new brick building, however, opened in 1900, could house 55 nurses and allowed each nurse to have her own room. It also had facilities that included a lecture room, dining room, recreation room, and a library. The nurses' home, which also helped to block from public view some of the hospital's outbuildings, was erected by the Hartford builder John W. Gilbert. This is a postcard that shows the nurses' home with the Contagious Diseases Pavilion on the far right. This postcard is a view of the hospital south across Jefferson Street from the old people's home. The nurses' home is on the left. Again, just to the west of it is the Contagious Diseases building. And south of that is the laundry and coal house with their smokestacks. To the right are the various wings that made up the hospital's H-plan layout. The latest addition in this picture is the 1903 Children's Wing, extending to Retreat Avenue, which I'll talk about in a few moments. Before the new Children's Wing was built, there had been another addition to the hospital's facility on the north side of Jefferson Street. In 1901-2, a new assembly hall designed by the architects Davis and Brooks was added to the rear of the old people's home, as shown on the right in a section from our next Hartford Atlas, which was published in 1909. Turning now to the same atlas's depiction of the hospital south of Jefferson Street, it shows several additions made to the building in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, I should point out that over the years there were numerous changes made to the interior of the hospital. Spaces were updated to accommodate new technology, such as the installation of electric lights in 1899. Hospital departments were also sometimes moved due to changing needs. For instance, the third floor of the old central building served successively as the hospital's first operating room, then as a portrait gallery. Then it became the first dedicated children's department, and later was a gynecological ward. A 1907 gift by one of the hospital's directors, Austin C. Dunham, resulted in a significant alteration and addition to the old North Wing, which was part of the original section of the hospital that first opened in 1860. As related by the Hartford Courant on April 5, 1907, quote, The changes at the hospital involve the transforming of Ward Number 1 in the North Wing into private rooms, from 12 to 15 in number, the building of a private operating room in connection with this wing, and the installation of an elevator. The operating room will be a single story in height and will be fitted with every appliance and convenience known to modern surgery. The elevator will connect directly with this operating room as well as the floors above. The installation of the elevator will be a most desirable improvement, meaning less suffering for patients and the saving of valuable time to the surgeons. At present, patients are taken in the ambulance to the main entrance, and if an operation is necessary, must be carried through the corridor to the operating room. When the elevator is completed, the ambulance will be driven to an entrance on the east side, the patient will be placed on the elevator, and taken to the place of operation." Unquote. The same article noted that, quote, "For the first time in the history of the institution, it has, during the past year, been run within its income, and the year ended with a balance of $500 on the right side." Unquote. Another new addition, erected in 1902 directly behind the old central building, was a one-story structure with a monitor roof built to house a new hospital kitchen. It was attached to the old kitchen in the central building, which then became a special diet kitchen. Around this same time, the hospital hired a dietitian who, as the Current described, quote, "will practically be the head of a new department for the instruction of nurses in the preparation of a suitable diet for patients under their charge. She will also have charge of the food which is cooked for the patients." Unquote. As I mentioned earlier, on the Retreat Avenue side there was a new wing built in 1903 that housed the Eliza Trumbull Robinson Memorial Children's Wards. It was east of and parallel to the earlier Children's Ward of 1891. A brownstone structure designed by William C. Brocklesby, it had a girls' ward on the first floor and a boys' ward on the second floor, both of which were attached to a solarium on the south end. Also, as the Current described it, quote, "the basement is used as a chronic ward for old ladies." Unquote. On the left is a view of the hospital from Retreat Avenue, with the new children's ward and attached solarium on the right, the earlier children's ward of 1891 in the center, and the original south wing of 1871 on the left. This postcard has a view to the north and east and shows the same three wings, as well as the porte-cochere at the entrance to the central building on the far left. Just south of the 1871 wing is where the structure known as the Brownstone building, which I'll talk about shortly, stands today. This later view of the same area shows the next major changes to the hospital. The 1891 wing, which had come to be used as a maternity ward, was extended in 1912 with space added for a nursery and an operating room. There was also a new solarium or sun parlor at its south end. On the far left is the hospital's next major structure to be built, the new administration building completed in 1916. As shown on the right, in a section from the Hartford Atlas of 1917, this new structure was built right in front of the old center building. This meant that the porte-cochere was removed, and the new building now became the main entrance to Hartford Hospital. The four-story Colonial Revival-style building, designed by architect A. Raymond Ellis, was intended not only to provide office space and reception space, but could also accommodate 37 patients in private rooms. Also, reflecting the continuing advancement of technology, an X-ray suite was located in the basement. Now let's take a moment to talk about the great American showman George M. Cohan. On September 4th, 1913, Cohan and 4 others, one of whom was his 13-year-old daughter Georgia, were traveling in a Packard touring car from New York to Hartford for rehearsals of Cohan's latest play, 7 Keys to Baldpate. On the Berlin Turnpike, about 2 miles south of Cedar Hill Cemetery, their car was overturned after a collision with a garbage wagon. Everyone was thrown from the vehicle. Cohan broke his shoulder, and his daughter suffered a skull fracture. They received such excellent care during a 2-week stay at Hartford Hospital that the famous playwright, songwriter, and actor returned to Hartford a year later to present a benefit performance of his new play for 1914, The Miracle Man, at the Parsons Theater. Part of the money raised by the performance was used in 1917 to erect the George M. Cohan verandas along the length of wards 3 and 4 of the hospital. Another recent addition to the hospital depicted in the 1917 atlas was a new wing erected in 1910 at the southeast corner of the nurses' home. It was designed by Edward T. Hapgood to match the architecture of the original section built a decade earlier. The expanded facility could now accommodate up to 160 nurses. The old lecture room was absorbed into an expanded dining room, and a new lecture room was opened in the basement of the addition. In the coming years, the need for more space for nurses would only increase, and several more buildings would be erected in the 1920s in the area along Jefferson Street, just east of the original nurses' home and in front of the 1910 addition. This later photograph shows the Colonial Revival-style additions, a new dormitory on the left, and in the center the auditorium known as Highblind Hall. Performances were frequently given in the hall by the Nurses Training School's Glee Club and Dramatic Club. On the right is a section from the 1922-23 Sanborn Atlas of Hartford. This was published a few years before those additions were added to the northeast corner of the Nurses Training School that I just showed. For the first time in our perusal of historic maps of Hartford, this one depicts 2 additions to the hospital that are still standing today. One is the Hall Wilson Laboratory, a brownstone building erected in 1922 and designed by architect Carl J. Malmfelt. It provided laboratory spaces for the hospital's growing pathology department, as well as space for a new and more sophisticated autopsy room. The historic brownstone structure was in danger of being demolished recently, but the hospital has announced the building will be saved and equipped to serve a new purpose, to contain electrical switching equipment. The other surviving building along Retreat Avenue is one also designed by Malmfelt. It's called the Brownstone Building now, but when it was erected in 1923, it was known as the Women's Building, and the primary purpose of the 7-story structure was as a maternity ward. The last major additions to the hospital before the massive changes of the 1940s occurred along the Jefferson Street side of the hospital complex after this particular atlas was published in the early 1920s. Some of these additions replaced earlier structures, and several of them survive today. They appear in the postcard I showed earlier that presents an aerial view of the hospital in 1948. First, let's survey the older portions of the hospital. In the center are the buildings of the original H-plan, erected between 1857 and the early 1880s. Just east of this is the Administration Building of 1916. Along Jefferson Street are the 2 wings, one added in 1891 and extended in 1912, and the other in 1903, plus the 2 structures on this side that I mentioned do survive today, the Hall Wilson Laboratory and the Women's Building, now called the Brownstone Building. Turning to the Jefferson Street side, there's the interconnected buildings I showed earlier called the Nurses' Home. The Nurses' Training School was renamed the Hartford Hospital School of Nursing in 1940. Just west of these buildings is the 1927 Ingalls Building, designed by Carl J. Momfelt. It is the first of 3 buildings along Jefferson Street that survive today. The Ingalls Building was built in approximately the same area where the old Contagious Diseases Pavilion had once stood. In 1932, the Ingalls Building was connected to the nurses' complex by a new 2-story dormitory and kitchen wing. Just west of the Ingalls Building is the Florence Crane Building, which survives today as well. Dedicated in January of 1930, it was designed by Kendall Taylor and Company of Boston and housed the hospital's eye, ear, nose, and throat department. The building was a gift of the parents of Florence Crane, who were impressed by the care that their daughter, a student at Miss Porter's school in Farmington, had received at the hospital. The Crane Building replaced the old 1876 wing that had been the old northeast section of the original H-plan. The last of the survivors along Jefferson Street is the Mary Robinson Cheney Memorial Library, which was a gift of her husband, the hospital's then president, Colonel Lewis R. Cheney, and her daughter, Mrs. John T. Roberts. Mary Cheney had earlier donated the Women's Building in memory of her late sister, Eliza Trumbull Robinson. Dedicated in 1928, the Cheney Library is located at what was the north end of the now lost original hospital wing that opened in 1860. Designed by Carl Momfelt, the Colonial Revival-style building contained not only a library but residential rooms for staff members and recreation areas for interns. The building was altered in 1935 when a 4th floor was added, to designs by the architectural firm of Ebbets and Frid. Another lost brownstone structure designed by Momfelt was the single-story Capewell Memorial X-ray Building, which was located on South Hudson Street. I'm not sure of its exact location, but it may have been the building I've circled here. Named in memory of George J. Capewell, founder of the Capewell Horse Nail Company, it was dedicated in 1926. This section of South Hudson Street would be eliminated in the 1940s, when the South Building opened in 1942 and the High Building opened in 1948, as I mentioned at the top of this video. These buildings were the realization of a plan conceived over a decade earlier. The project had been championed by George Jackson Meade, a hospital board member and director of engineering at the Pratt & Whitney Aircraft Company. He'd been dismayed when his son, who was receiving treatment for a stomach blockage, had to be wheeled through a labyrinth of corridors to get to surgery. There was definitely a need for a more modern hospital structure. The construction plan had been delayed due to the Second World War. Excavation work for the High Building had actually begun 9 days after the surrender of Japan. Just north of the High Building was an apartment building that housed nurses and hospital residents. East of that is where the next component of the new hospital campus would be erected. This postcard from 1949 shows the hospital triangle from the west. The apartment building I just mentioned is on the left, and next to it is the Jefferson Street Medical Building. It housed medical offices and was erected in 1949. Connected to the adjoining High Building, it was financed, owned, and operated by the Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company. This was the last major part of the major expansion of the hospital campus in the 1940s. In May of 1949, a month after the Jefferson Building opened, the hospital proceeded with demolition of its oldest buildings, erected between 1857 and 1916. As the Hartford Courant explained at the time, the demolition of 6 buildings was expected to solve the problem of a lack of parking space. Underneath the new parking lot, a tunnel was constructed to link the new hospital buildings to surviving parts of the campus to the east. In this last section of the video, I want to mention some later changes at Hartford Hospital, both new construction and demolition of older buildings. After the building boom of the 1940s, the next major period of expansion was in the 1960s. This postcard has another view of the front of the hospital with the Jefferson Street Medical Building on the left. The adjoining apartment building was demolished to make way for the expansion of the medical building, which, like the earlier section, was designed by the architects Moore and Salisbury of West Hartford. The addition was constructed in 1961, the same year that a fire swept through the 9th floor of the neighboring High building. 16 people died in the December 8, 1961 fire, which was started by cigarette butts thrown down the trash chute that ran down the side of the building. This postcard shows the expanded Jefferson Street Medical Building at the corner of Jefferson and Seymour Streets. On the far left is the old brick and brownstone Cheney Library building. The next addition to the hospital was the Continuing Care Unit next to the South Building. Opened in 1966, it is now known as the Conklin Building. Now let's turn back to the north side of Jefferson Street. Remember that this is where the Old People's Home had opened back in 1884. That building, renamed Jefferson House in 1953, was demolished in 1965 to make way for a new campus for the School of Nursing. The new campus opened in 1967. Depicted on this postcard, it was designed by Moore and Salisbury, architects of the Jefferson Street Medical Building. It included an educational building and an 8-story residence hall, both of which still exist today, although the School of Nursing itself closed its doors in 1976, less than a decade after this campus opened. Just east of these new buildings was an older part of the School of Nursing that was renovated in conjunction with the new project. This was the D. Newton Barney Education Building, erected in 1932. Designed by Kendall Taylor and Company, it contained classrooms and laboratories, as well as a gymnasium and a swimming pool. The Barney building was torn down in 2014 to make way for a new education and resource center. The last component of this 1960s development project was the erection of the hospital's Bliss Wing, which extends eastward from the rear of the High building. Ground was broken in 1968, and the building was dedicated in 1972. In many ways, the construction of this wing brings us back to the beginning of the story of Hartford Hospital in this historic triangle, because it extends right through the middle of the area where the oldest hospital buildings were located. The hospital and its associated institutions have continued to expand in more recent years. The Helen and Harry Gray Cancer Center opened in 1990. The Connecticut Children's Medical Center was erected next to Hartford Hospital in 1996. The core building was completed in 2002, and most recently the Bone and Joint Institute opened in 2016. Other historic structures associated with Hartford Hospital include the Wildwood Sanatorium and the later Avery Convalescent Hospital on Cedar Mountain. There's also the campus of the Institute of Living, which merged with Hartford Hospital in 1994. All of these really deserve their own videos. Thank you for watching this video, which is a little longer than usual, and please remember to subscribe if you want more content like this. Thanks.